Good afternoon and welcome to the Grandfamilies and Kinship Care Provisions of the Consolidated Appropriations Act webinar of 2021. You're here with our presenters from Generations United, Children's Defense Fund, and the American Bar Association Center on Children in the Law. And we will get started in a few minutes. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Grandfamilies and Kinship Care Provisions of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Hopefully you can all hear the presentation well, but if you're struggling with the computer connection, instead of listening through your computer speakers, you can also call in on your phone, and the numbers should be listed in your email under the link that you used to join the call. Throughout the presentation, you can drop any questions that you have in the Q&A discussion box. There are two boxes as part of this webinar, a Q&A box and a chat box. We ask that you use the Q&A box for any questions that come up and the chat box for any comments or conversations between participants or for any technical assistance needs that you might have. We are collecting questions throughout the presentation. We recognize that we have a limited period of time to actually do Q&A at the end of the session, but want to elevate for you that we are collecting these questions and our intent is to elevate them with the federal government for guidance and with others in Congress or other places in leadership that may need to be aware of the questions that are being raised from the field. However, we will answer them when we can, and we invite you to visit Generations United and join our list to make sure you get any updates on resources that we have, and that's gu@gu.org or gu.org. After the presentation, we will provide the PowerPoint slides and a recording of the webinar that will be available at least next week, potentially sooner. And want to make sure that folks know that registrants will receive an email with a link to the recording and follow-up materials, and that those materials include a summary of the Grandfamilies provisions of the Act. Today's speakers include Ana Beltran, who's the co-director of the National Center on Grandfamilies here at Generations United. Along with myself, I'm the Deputy Executive Director and co-director of the National Center on Grandfamilies. Stephanie Spro and Stephen Olander, who can introduce themselves right before they speak, but they're with the Children's Defense Fund. And Heidi Redlich Upstein with the American Bar Association Center on Children and the Law. And here we go. Just a little bit of legislative context before we begin. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 contains the fourth major COVID-19 response package from Congress. Some of you may have joined previous presentations from Generations United, where we provided highlights of one of the first packages, the CARES Act. And we just wanted to flag that there are still some resources flowing from the CARES Act, and there's opportunities to be really doing local advocacy in your community. We have these resources available for more information about the CARES Act. You can link to them from this link here on your screen. There's a summary of the provisions affecting grandfamilies, a tool for educating your local decision makers, and then talking points and preparation tips for doing that education. And then, of course, Congress is in the midst of additional negotiations for the next major package. We don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know, of course, for sure when that next package will move. The latest pieces that I've heard on the news and on the Hill is that they're sort of shooting for mid-March, but it's a big question in terms of when another piece will actually move to provide additional relief. So today we will be having really 4 major pieces that we'll be covering in this webinar. First of all, we will talk about new appropriations to help grand families. And when we're talking about appropriations, that's money that the federal government gives each year for certain programs supports. So there's some new annual dollars that are being given, and some are specifically dedicated to supports and services for grand families. And that's because that Consolidated Appropriations Act had 2 major parts. It had the funding for the year, and then also had pandemic response. So those 2 pieces. The second piece we'll be covering are the Grand Families provisions of the Supporting Foster Youth and Families Through the Pandemic Act. And I'll talk just a little bit more about that, but you'll be hearing a lot about that piece of legislation that was included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And then from Heidi, we will hear some highlights from Children's Bureau information memorandums. So that is information that comes from the Children's Bureau, and she'll provide highlights that are really specific to supporting and helping grand families. And then finally, we will have some time, we hope to have a little bit of time to elevate some questions from the field. So please drop them throughout, and if we have time to respond, we will do that. But if we don't have time to respond to your questions, please know that we are making note of them, and we'll follow up and elevate them with the people that need to hear them and can help respond. So just a little more context about the Supporting Foster Youth and Families Through the Pandemic Act. That is, the bill number was HR 7947. You will be hearing presenters refer to this throughout the presentation. That bill, which was included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act, was bipartisan legislation. It was introduced by Chairman Danny Davis, Democrat from Illinois, and Ranking Member Jackie Walorski, Republican from Indiana, who are with the Worker and Family Support Committee of the House Ways and Means Committee. And it really does 4 major things in terms of critical pandemic relief. It provides it to grand families and kinship families. There's a whole series of provisions to young people and those aging out of foster care. Also those that serve vulnerable children and families in or at risk of entering foster care. And then there's a series of investments to help the state and tribal child welfare agencies adjust their practice in response to the pandemic. So from there, I'm going to turn it over to Anna, who's really honing in on those programs or those supports in the Act that are specifically naming and dedicated to grand families or kinship families. Anna.
Thank you so much, Jaya, and thank you all for joining us today. So I'm going to start with the provisions in both the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the act that Jaya just elevated, which is in that act, that talks about Kinship Navigator programs, because we're very excited about this. And so just to give you some context, these are federal Kinship Navigator requirements. They've existed now for over a dozen years. And these are basically what these programs need to be. So they are information and referral places that connect caregivers and children to services and supports they need. And they should do that by partnering with local agencies and organizations. They must do that by partnering and really leveraging all those resources in the community. And then outreaching to the families, reaching out to the families to provide them these services. So these are essentially the musts of these programs that are going to get federal funding. So to drill down on that a little bit on the next slide, you'll see that the new legislation has 2 new funding opportunities, and there's a current one that's out there right now. So for the 4th year in a row, there's going to be $20 million that's sent out to all the states, tribes, and territories to develop these Kinship Navigator programs. And there's going to be a 4th year, that application will come out very shortly. We're expecting it at any time. And that will look like the other other years that you have gotten. But then the Pandemic Act, the relief, also provides 100% reimbursement of all Kinship Navigator costs dating back to April 1st of last year through September of this year. And the idea is that's the pandemic period. So hopefully we'll be done with the pandemic at the end of September. So we have these 3 federal funding opportunities, and you can see that 2 of them are kind of overlapping right now. But as we know, the many of the programs that are really robust, that federal funding that you received, which was non-competitive, didn't really cover all your costs. So what you can do now is go back and seek federal reimbursement for all your costs that you've incurred since the pandemic began. So how do these funds, these pots of money differ? Well, for the 2020 and the 2021 Kinship Navigator funds, so these are these annual appropriations that almost all of you got. They were non-competitive, and they can be used for Kinship Navigator programs from the very initial planning stages all the way through evaluation. So those requirements that we started with, getting up to speed on all those requirements and evaluating, because that was the requirement that was added just a few years ago, was that these Kinship Navigator programs have to meet evidence-based standards. So it can be for that whole continuum, right? And what those funds have to be accomplishing is that they've got to be designed to ultimately fulfill those Kinship Navigator requirements that we just went through, in addition to the evidence-based requirement that was an add-on about 3 years ago. Now, for the new pandemic relief money, the programs basically have to be in place. So you have to be essentially doing those requirements that we went through at the very beginning. So those from the Fostering Connections Act that have been around for 13 years. But you don't have to be currently being evaluated. You have to be thinking about it. So you have to be in the process or going to be in the process of being evaluated. And this piece is different than that ongoing yearly appropriation. So you've got to provide kind of an assurance that we're doing an evaluation or we're going to be doing an evaluation. Now, what I want to elevate here is there's an opportunity right now in the initial stages. Casey Family Programs, Generations United, and the University of Washington is collaborating on a cross-site Kinship Navigator program model. And we are going to provide technical assistance around that model. And it's going to be several jurisdictions, several states. And if you're interested, please join us. And that will likely meet that evaluation assurance requirement, your involvement. But we don't know for sure yet because we're waiting on federal guidance, and including that application form for the 2021 funds and how you all go about getting this reimbursement back from April 2020. But we have talked to Children's Bureau and we expect it to be coming out shortly. And that's why it's so important that we collect your questions so that we get them all answered for you too, because there are still quite a few open-ended questions. So what can these pots of money pay for? Well, essentially it's the same things. Evaluation costs. So all your evaluation costs can be paid for using the 100% reimbursement, using your annual appropriations, including all your program costs too. So all those information and referral costs, in addition to concrete goods that you provide the families. Now, this has always been in that May category of what your program can do, but now with the pandemic, it's really being elevated. So know that you can provide gas vouchers, all those kinds of direct relief food to the families. Also, legal services. So a technical bulletin came out during the pandemic saying you could use that annual appropriation for brief legal services. Now, what we know is that annual appropriation didn't cover all that. So many of you weren't doing that just because the money wasn't stretching that far. But now with this 100% reimbursement, you really have the opportunity to provide that as well. And then it's really important to remember that once your program is evaluated and once it goes into the Title IV-E Prevention Services Clearinghouse and they approve it as meeting their evidence-based standards, then after September 30th and to infinity, you can get 50% of all your program costs reimbursed. So you want to develop as robust and as helpful a program as possible so that you can get that 50% reimbursement. And there's just a lot of federal support here. So we encourage you to access it. Also want to point out that the Pandemic Act, that 100% reimbursement, does call out a few things that are very COVID specific. So COVID testing, alternative care plans, helping those caregivers make a plan in the event of the caregiver's death, testing, treatment, all those kinds of things. Now here, I just cut and pasted this because it's not shared online. There's no link to share it. But just this is a notice that went out to all child welfare directors from the federal government, from the Children's Bureau and the Department of Health and Human Services, really laying out, and you'll get these slides after, but really laying out how you can do those direct services and really giving you permission for those concrete goods. So, you know, bus tokens, gas vouchers, grocery store, even technology. And then here it lays out all the regulations that impact how you go about buying technology for the caregivers and the children and supporting them in that way. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the Kinship Navigator piece. And I know it's a lot to take in, so we'll be eager to hear your questions at the end and to respond to them ongoing. But know that there's just some amazing opportunities in this new act for Kinship Navigator programs. Then Grandfamilies housing. This was a very welcome and wonderful surprise that after almost 18 years, when the Legacy Act was first passed, which is the first and only affordable housing act for grandfamilies, for specialized housing for them with services on site. The act provides another $5 million to expand that availability of that housing. And to learn more about this type of housing, you can go to our 2019 State of Grandfamilies report for Generations United, and there's a link right there on the slide to that report. But we're excited about that, and we'll be working with HUD to make sure that that is expands the availability of this important housing. I am now going to turn it over to my colleagues at the Children's Defense Fund.
Hi there. Thank you, Anna. So next we'll talk through some of the provisions of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 that are not directly kinship provisions, but that have an impact for kinship families, and about some of the opportunities for grandfamilies as well as advocates and policymakers to leverage some of those opportunities for kin. So the first space is in prevention. So the Supporting Foster Youth and Families through the Pandemic Act had two key areas where they directly touched on prevention in a way that can impact kinship families and ultimately support kinship families. The first part is that it provides $75 million for Title IV-B Subpart 2, the Mary Lee Allen Promoting Safe and Stable Families program. And we'll go a little bit more into what exactly that means. And then also the second part is that it increases federal reimbursements for the Title IV-E prevention program from 50% up to 100% for the COVID public health emergency period, similar to the pieces for Kinship Navigator programs. So Title IV-B Subpart 2 is otherwise more commonly known as the Mary Lee Allen Promoting Safe and Stable Families program, or PSSF. And PSSF funds can be used for any of the purposes that are listed here: family support, family preservation, reunification, adoption, promotion, and foster family recruitment and retention. And importantly for this purpose, they're able to be used upstream, meaning that they can be used before children ever enter the child welfare system, which most federal funds for child welfare, that's not the case. And they can be used for kinship families who are inside of the child welfare system, but also kinship families who are outside of the formal child welfare system. As I said before, these are extremely flexible funds to meet the needs of families and to help stabilize and preserve them. But it's going to be really important as these funds are going out that we advocate that they're used to meet the needs of families and really proactively support families, so that these funds don't just wind up filling other holes in state budgets. So if you have a relationship with your state agency, you can push on that relationship and try to push the state agency to prioritize as they're putting these funds out, making sure that they go to support kinship families. But even if you don't have those relationships, it's really valuable and really important to continue to elevate the needs of grandfamilies, of your family, and other grandfamilies in your network. Congress appropriated these funds because they were hearing from families like yours about the needs throughout the pandemic. And now the states really need to continue to hear from you so that these funds get spent well and in a way that is beneficial. If we can go to the next slide. So the next piece of it was, as I had mentioned, the 100% match for the Title IV-E prevention program. Now, Title IV-E is an entitlement program that does most of the federal funding for child welfare. But prior to the passage of the Family First Prevention Services Act in 2018, those funds were only able to be used once a child entered the child welfare system. But Family First created the Title IV-E prevention program, which reimburses states for certain evidence-based substance use, mental health, and skill-based parenting programs for families who have children who are at risk of entering the child welfare system. And the purpose of that is really to prevent those families and those children from entering the child welfare system. So this act increases the match for those, which is currently at 50%, up to 100%, meaning that the federal government will cover any and all costs. The caveat to that is that it will cover program costs only for states that are currently have an approved Title IV-E prevention plan, which is only 8 states currently. However, once a state submits their plan, even before it's been approved, they're able to receive reimbursement for the administration and training funds for those plans, starting as soon as they introduce their plans. And so those are the sorts of funds that would allow them to build up the infrastructure and do the training for people so that they're really ready when their plan is approved to start providing those services. And that's a really great space for kinship families, for advocates to really get involved with. First, if your state has not submitted a plan yet, this is a spot where we can push states or move states to try to submit their plans. Unfortunately, the fact that states are able to access the administration and training funds as soon as they submit their plans has not been well messaged to states, and a lot don't realize that. So they can put forward a plan. It does not need to be their final plan of what they will go for. This is really built so that states can move through this. They can iterate on their process and amend their plans once they have submitted it. So they can just submit not a bare bones plan, but a plan that just meets all of the federal requirements to submit their plan, so they can draw down those funds and then continue to move through and improve on their plan as they go forward. It's important for us to be pushing on the states to do that so they can take advantage of these funds, but also to make sure that as they are designing their program, both in their initial plan that they put forward, but also in those further amendments to the plan, that they're really thinking of how they can support kin, because the services that are available under the IV-E prevention plan are available to kin. And so we need to be thinking of the way they do that. And then also, once they submit their plan, we can be working with them to make sure that they're using the administration money to build the infrastructure to continue to work with kin, and that they're also using the training funds to train staff on the specific needs of kin, the different ways that they can be supporting kin or working with kin, because this is a really great opportunity for 100% reimbursed funds from the federal government to make sure that when these programs are up and running really well, that they are really prepared to work with kin and meet the needs of kin. And then there were some pieces related to housing that were outside of the Supporting Foster Youth and Families Through the Pandemic Act. And the biggest piece of this is the Fostering Stable Housing Opportunities Act. This came out of a piece that was really driven by foster youth and written by foster youth and former foster youth. And it codifies some changes that were made over the last several years through regulation, and it puts them into law. And those are related to Housing and Urban Development's FUP voucher program, or Family Unification Program. This provides housing vouchers for youth for up to 36 months for youth who are aged 18 to 24, who either have already aged out of the child welfare system or will leave foster care within the next 90 days, and who are at risk of homelessness. Now, before this, the vouchers weren't available on demand, which meant that we couldn't really coordinate well between public housing authorities and child welfare agencies to make sure that as youth were exiting care, they were immediately met with vouchers to help support them. The other piece of this is that these vouchers are available for families where a child would otherwise enter the foster care system or be placed into out-of-home care if the only reason that they would is because the family does not have adequate housing, and if adequate housing could solve that problem so that kids could stay at home. Public housing authorities who dole out these vouchers really may need help reaching out to grandfamilies to let them know about this change. And that's a space where people on this call can really help. You can also make sure that as they are thinking about who they should be reaching out to and what families qualify for these funds, really make them understand that grandfamilies should be part of their definition of families in that space. It's a space for Kinship Navigator programs to really help families, grandfamilies connect their transition age youth to public housing authorities so that this can happen. And families should be thinking about whether FUP vouchers are potentially right for their youth who are close to aging out of the child welfare system, but also other youth in their network, other families who might not know about this and might be able to benefit from these vouchers. And then just a few other final provisions. The bill also, or the act also extended the federal eviction moratorium. It was extended until January 31st, but Biden, through executive action, has now extended that through the end of March. And that means that people can't be evicted solely for the fact that they aren't able to pay rent right now. You can still be evicted for other things if you light your building on fire or things like that. But can't be evicted for not paying rent. It does not get rid of the need to pay rent. So as soon as that moratorium ends, people will have to pay that back rent. And that's where Congress also appropriated $25 billion for rental assistance. These are funds that are dedicated solely to helping people pay that rent. It is currently being distributed to state and local governments, and state and local governments will then have to develop guidelines and distribute that money out. Some states have already started that process. Others will need more time to put forward the guidance. So that's something to look in on the basis of a state-by-state level. But is definitely something that we should be thinking about, and something that Kinship Navigator programs should be thinking about, connecting people to different services and those funds in their community. I'll pass it over to Stephanie Sproul.
Thanks, Stephen. My name is Stephanie Sproul, and I also work at the Children's Defense Fund. And I'm going to share information on some important emergency supports and the relief package that are designed specifically to help older youth navigate the pandemic, particularly those who are about to age out of foster care or those who recently left care. And these emergency supports were made in response to the very unique challenges that these young people were facing, who often have limited help, many of whom are forced to navigate this pandemic alone on their own. And so while these provisions are geared towards older youth, there are some important connections to flag here that could apply to some older youth and kinship families. The Consolidated Appropriations Act provided additional funding for the Chafee program, which is a program that is designed specifically to support older youth in care as they are leaving care to help with their transition to adulthood and independence. And in addition to those new funds, there are several important policy changes that were made to further help these youth during the pandemic. So there was an additional $350 million that was provided to Chafee to help older youth with urgent needs caused by the pandemic. So this could include funding for housing, food, money to cover bills, technology and internet access and other services. And there was another $50 million for the educational training vouchers to help youth stay connected to post-secondary education and training programs, many of which were upended during the pandemic. There are specific eligibility requirements for the CHAFE program, and states do have flexibility in who they can serve, but eligible youth are people who include those who were in foster care at the age of 14 and older, those who aged out of care and are under the age of 21, or youth who were adopted or entered guardianship at age 16 or older and are under 21, which I think is particularly relevant for this group. While those are the core eligibility requirements for CHAFE, the relief bill did make an important policy change here that extends the time that youth can benefit from CHAFE programs and ETVs, which are now available until age 27, so through age 26. And I just want to flag this can be a little confusing when you're talking about these services being eligible for these young people because they are building off of those core eligibility requirements, but they are extended to age 27. So if you were a young person who aged out of care in 2018 because you turned 21, that young person will be eligible to again now receive those CHAFE services at the age of 24 under this new extension created under the Relief Act. The Relief Act also made changes that prohibit a state from letting a youth exit care solely based on age, often referred to as aging out, to ensure that no young person is cut off from critical housing or other supports during the pandemic. This also allows young people to voluntarily re-enter foster care if they want to. There were several other important provisions included to help older youth that we don't highlight here, but there are more comprehensive summaries on those provisions that we will include in some of the follow-up materials that will be shared after this webinar. But we did want to flag these specific pieces because we felt there are many important connections that can be made here in regards to how this can apply to kinship families caring for older youth who may be eligible for this new support. So we think there is an important role for Kinship Navigator programs here in elevating these new changes and helping to spread the word about the availability of these new additional funds to families that are caring for youth who are CHAFE eligible, as these funds can provide very critical help to families in a very flexible way. As we said, they can be used for direct financial assistance, food, money to cover monthly bills, help with technology and internet access, which we know is particularly important right now for many young people who are trying to navigate remote education or work. We also mentioned that there is additional money for education training vouchers, which can be a major lifeline for so many young people who are preparing for adulthood and to become self-sufficient. And these ETVs really make it possible for so many young people in care or formerly in care to maintain or complete their education or training programs. These new ETV funds can be used for costs related to attending or remaining enrolled in programs, including tuition, room and board, books, supplies, transportation, financial aid for dependent care, in addition to covering expenses that are not part of the cost of attendance, but would help support that young person in remaining enrolled. And so that could be flexible. That could be potentially buying a laptop, relocation expenses, childcare, monthly internet, car insurance. It's also worth noting here that these ETV funds work really well with the Kinship Navigator funds that could also be used to help with remote learning and technology, as Anna mentioned earlier in the webinar. So we really encourage Kinship Navigator programs to become familiar with the eligibility requirements of CHAFE and ETVs and connect with your state independent living and ETV coordinator who are in charge of overseeing those programs and who can provide families and young people with more detailed information on those programs and who could help them apply for those emergency funds. There is also money specifically set aside, if we could go back just one more slide, Jaya, for young people for driving and transportation assistance. And this can help youth cover the costs related to obtaining a driver's license, such as vehicle insurance, driver's education and testing fees, practice lessons, licensing fees, roadside assistance, and also assistance in purchasing an automobile. And states will be able to provide young people up to $4,000 for this driving and transportation assistance. Youth are also able to re-enter care during the pandemic, and Kinship Navigator programs and child welfare agencies and others should be doing extensive outreach to make sure that young people who have aged out of foster care during the pandemic know of this new option, including those kinship families who were either caring for a young person who aged out during the pandemic or are currently caring for a young person who is approaching that age in a state where they would normally age out, to make sure that that family understands about the temporary moratorium and that they can continue caring and receiving assistance for that young person through September 2021. Lastly, the new law also includes a provision that made several significant changes to the free application for student aid program, often known as FAFSA, which is in an attempt to help streamline the process for youth who had experienced foster care as they're applying for student loan aid. This provision that doesn't go into effect until July 2023, but we thought that was important to flag for many of these families. Ultimately, I think the big takeaway here for these older youth provisions and for Kinship Navigator programs and other stakeholders that work with kin. One is to become educated on these new provisions because there's a lot of opportunities in here for additional help to these families. Two is just helping to spread the word so we make sure young people are aware of this new support. And three is really just help coordinating with those in your state that are really the experts in this. And so some of those Chafee and ETV state coordinators to help develop a process for connecting families to more information and helping those get the assistance in their hands. It really is just incredibly important that we work together to expedite the access to these critical resources before they expire because they are temporary. I'm going to now turn it over to Heidi Rutlick-Epstein at the ABA Center on Children and the Law to talk a little bit more about the Court Improvement Program.
And to some of you, good morning. Glad you could join us today. So another important piece of this act was some funding for the Court Improvement Program. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Court Improvement Program, also known often as the CIP, it's a federal initiative that gives money to the courts, the child welfare courts in every state, to promote improvement and reforms. Each state is tasked with kind of prioritizing their own use of these funds. Some states use it for judicial training, data sharing, and we have seen some of the state CIP programs have really taken an interest and focus on improving kinship practice in their states. So we're happy to see that this act has provided some additional funding. Under the Consolidated Appropriations Act, it reauthorized the CIP program as well as provided emergency funding for CIPs to be used to activities related to COVID. And so examples of that would be some technology investments. We know that a lot of states and most states have really had to pivot and go to remote hearings only, but didn't have the technology for that. So that was really probably one of the biggest pieces that this emergency funding is allowing states to be able to put that technology in place. The training that goes along with facilitating those remote hearings is critically important. Not everybody is well versed in the use of the technology that's needed to really have an effective and efficient hearing system when we're really used to being in court in person. Additionally, money was set aside for tribal court improvement activities and basically any program to help families avoid any delays that they may experience in legal proceedings as a result of COVID-19. So again, looking at sort of the flexibility of how those funds are being used to help families participate meaningfully, kinship families, parents, children in their own hearings is really important. And we've really seen a lot of states do some tremendous work around engagement in this electronic and virtual world in having people participate in their hearings. In fact, some states have reported that they're having more participation than those hearings that occur in person. And then finally, any other purpose to assist courts and court personnel or related staff that's related to COVID-19. So looking at sort of how that court system needs to support the families and the child welfare system to make sure that we're not falling behind with regard to permanency and trying to look towards reunification as quickly as possible, and if not, other permanency options. So that's the funding that went over to the Court Improvement Program. So now we're going to talk about some of the guidance from the federal government. What we saw at the end of 2020, the beginning of 2021, was a lot of guidance that came out from the federal government to sort of help states use this funding and really look at flexibility in these trying times. I'm going to highlight three pieces of federal guidance that we feel are really important to talk about for kinship families but then I'm going to do a quick overview of some of the other ones. There were really at least, I think, 15 different pieces of guidance that came out in a span of just a few months. The first one actually came out in 2019, but it's so important that we felt like it was really worth discussing. And that was the information memorandum that came out that said it's critically important to engage, empower, and integrate family and youth voices in all aspects of child welfare system. Something that I really liked about this IM is it said that we recognize that families and youth are the experts of their own circumstances, that they're really the ones who have the best knowledge about solutions and the services that will benefit them. So we really need to make sure that we're reaching out to include those voices in policy decisions and practice decisions, and making sure that we're providing the services that are really helpful for families. And I think Kinship Navigator and other organizations and that help serve Kinship families should make sure that those voices are being heard. I think, making sure that we want to integrate the family voice into practice and look at things like what is happening in your jurisdiction to make sure that we're identifying families early, that we're placing with families, that we're asking families what services they need, asking them how we can help, making sure that we know that, again, they are the experts in what really helps their family, empowering them and allowing them to have that conversation and be at the table when people are looking at things like what are the right prevention services to provide, what are the right services to provide generally, and making sure that we know that their voice is there and we're hearing them. And that when we say family and the way it's being interpreted in the different guidance includes those kinship families. It's everybody who really is connected to the child. So that was the first one. The next important piece of guidance came out in 2020, and it looked at what are the flexibilities that exist currently in federal requirements to support grandfamilies, and encouraged and really pushed states to say, hey, we have these flexibilities and options to improve support for these kin who are caring for children. Let's make sure we're using them. And the two most important ones that they highlighted, they talked about a lot of them, but the two that they really highlighted was using waivers for non-safety related foster care licensing standards for relative foster care providers. So making sure that if there is a licensing standard in your state or with your tribe that would prevent a kinship family from providing foster care services for a related child, that we're looking at if it's non-safety, is that being waived? And then the other one was really encouraging participation in the Title 4A Guardianship Assistance Program, as we call it, GAP. And so if you're a state that has GAP, making sure that it's being used. And if you're a state that doesn't have GAP, why not? And trying to really push towards why, how we can improve those. The nice thing about this information memorandum is it really pulled together and highlighted a lot of the research and things that we know about the benefits of kinship care, as well as giving a list of ways that federal kinship requirements must be met by Title 4E agencies, states, and tribes. Another thing that this information memorandum did is it provided some data on the way how are states currently using their waivers and how are tribes currently using the waivers. It was really interesting to hear about the different ways that states are using waivers, and it really focused on some promising state strategies for the increased use of GAP and making sure that states are taking full advantage of this excellent federal program. So the next one comes under sort of the ability to extend flexibility for the federal government in times of such as these of pandemic and increased flexibility. So something that we saw from this program instruction was for the first time ever allowing federal foster care maintenance payments to be made during the period of provisional licensing. So provisional licensing allows a child to immediately be placed with a kinship caregiver and start drawing down those federal funds for foster care maintenance payment while that kinship caregiver is working towards becoming a fully licensed foster care provider for that child. And this was never done before. Usually during that provisional or emergency time, there were no federal funds available. So some states provided state funds and some didn't provide any funding for the kinship family. But under this program instruction, they're allowing that flexibility for federal funds to be used for that short period of time. Some states it can be up to 6 months. And what we have seen is because of the fact that it wasn't previously funded, some states use this sort of as a disincentive to immediately place children with kin because they couldn't get $40 for the children's placement. Another flexibility that we saw in this program instruction was that the option to extend foster care beyond 19, 20, or 21 without submitting a plan amendment. States, whenever they want to change the age that children are required to leave foster care, they would need to submit a plan amendment. And under this program instruction, they have the flexibility during this time to not have to submit a plan amendment, which allows some flexibility. It also looked at some of the criteria that's required for a child to stay in care beyond 18, the education and employment conditions that are required, and allowed some flexibility with regard to those as well. So those were the big ones we really wanted to talk about. I'm going to just kind of give a quick overview of the other ones. As I said, there were a lot of different pieces of federal guidance that came out. Another one was encouraging a partnership between resource parents, which includes kinship foster parents and biological parents, to make sure that we're really building that relationship and prioritizing children with kin and keeping siblings together, and really acknowledge the need for support for those kinship families. Another one looked at how can we improve permanency outcomes, including reunification, guardianship, and adoption, to make sure that we're really thinking about what is specific to those children and not just looking at permanency as sort of this kind of esoteric concept, but really more what is needed to meet the needs of that child. How can we achieve permanency for each specific child individually, and make sure that we're looking at it not sort of as a big issue, but on an individual basis, and looking at the needs of those children. Next slide, please. One information memorandum came out saying, we've learned a lot of things from this pandemic, and some of them are actually good things. And so we really want to make sure that we're looking at how resilient we are as a nation, and what we can do to take some of the things that we've learned to make sure that we're learning something and being a little more proactive, integrating those lessons into the child welfare system and the structures that we've built up. Another one addressed the cultural adaptations for tribes, to make sure that we're really trying to look at what are the key services that tribes need, and making sure that we're making adaptations in the system to allow for that flexibility. And finally, and one obviously coming from the American Bar Association we think is very important, is looking and making sure that there's high quality legal representation for everybody involved: parents, children, youth, child welfare agencies. And honestly, there are lots of things that have come out recently as well that have put into high quality legal representation for kinship caregivers as well. And that was really just a kind of a quick overview. There are lots of really interesting things in all of those guidance. So I'd recommend taking a look at those when you get a chance. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jaya.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone, for that helpful information. We are going to move next to just talk a little bit about additional resources, and then we'll turn to Q&A. Want to mention, Anna had mentioned in her presentation that there is an opportunity to participate in a cross-site Kinship Navigator project. There's a group of states coming together looking at doing a unified model and partnering with an evaluator that would work with the states to try to get their Navigator model to the evidence-based standard. And there is a webinar coming up on that identified here on February 16th from 1 to 2:30, and you can register at the link. This information, again, will be shared afterwards as well. So I wanted to make you all aware of that. Here is the contact information for all of our speakers. And while folks have a chance to get that down, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second here, and we'll do some Q&A. I do want to acknowledge that I know Anna and others have been responding to some questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. There are some questions that we may elevate for those of you that may be less familiar with chatting in the Q&A box and following that. There's a couple of questions I've seen come up a few times that I will elevate orally to the group. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And while I spend some time taking a look at all the questions that are coming up, one of the pieces that I think people are elevating and are anxious on is, how do I get to those Kinship Navigator dollars? So what is the process? And I think you touched on that, Anna, but can you speak to, there's these two pots of money. How do I get the appropriations money? How do I get the pandemic relief money? What are the two different systems for getting those dollars?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the 2021 annual appropriation, that will look very much like the previous three opportunities. So it will be some guidance that comes out from the Children's Bureau along with a brief application where you lay out how you're going to spend that money. That typically comes out in February, so we expect it anytime. And that the Title 4E, so the Child Welfare Agency, is the applicant on that. But they often elevate, and they should elevate, nonprofit partners as part of that proposal. So that'll look very much like what has been done for the last 3 years by the vast majority of you. The appropriations is more complicated. The 100% reimbursement is more complicated. And honestly, we have more questions than answers right now. We are awaiting, some information, however it comes out from the Children's Bureau, from the federal government, about exactly how to do that. But do know that it's a long time frame, and it is 100%. And we'll see, and we'll keep you abreast of what we learn. So that's about as good as I can do, unless anyone can add anything.
Great. CDF or ABA, do you have any additions to make to that? Okay. Thanks, Anna. We have a request. I would appreciate any suggestions on how to best advocate for the inclusion of kinship families who are not child welfare involved. So I think there's two pieces here. One is maybe a reminder to the audience about some of the pieces that are available for those families that aren't child welfare involved. And I wonder if this question was more geared towards those supports that were highlighted that are just for those child welfare involved families, like the education and training vouchers and those other pieces.
I don't think so, Jaya, because it
Okay.
was part of an ongoing chat. And I think, and please chat if this is the incorrect interpretation, but I think they were asking about how to advocate for the inclusion of informal families in their Kinship Navigator programs.
Okay.
Because there were a couple of Kinship Navigator programs that elevated that they're only serving those that are child welfare system involved. So I gave a very kind of short answer about how, these programs are envisioned as a prevention tool to keep these kinship families out of foster care, if that's the appropriate thing, and to really provide them a linkage with all these systems and supports that help them. So in terms of advocating for it, there's some language that we can give you, but it's basically just really important to elevate that these programs are really how they began back in 2008 with federal support, and even before that was more of a support actually for informal, and it didn't even include it formal in a lot of instances. And it really is a way to help them navigate the many silos that these families find themselves in. So aging children, child welfare, TANF, whatever, and keep them out of foster care if that was the best for their family. So going back to history, making the arguments, showing the savings to the state, that's often a very effective tool. That these families, by keeping their kids out of foster care, are saving taxpayers. We say $4 billion nationally every year. So those kinds of arguments.
Great. Thank you. And then elevating additional some questions that I think have had responses in the chat, but I just want to elevate them orally as well. One of the question is, will children who live with grandparents who have Article 6 custody receive ETV vouchers? So just clarification on who qualifies for the ETV vouchers, those who are in foster care. And I think I'll turn that to either Steph or Stephen. Do you want to just clarify who qualifies for those of kinship families?
Yep, thank you. So we did include on the slide the Chafee eligibility, which is very similar to who qualifies for the education training vouchers. But, right now that program is very much tied to youth who were in foster care or currently in foster care. So it is limited to how it can reach families who weren't, who are informally involved with the system. But those ETV vouchers, are generally available to youth who are likely to remain in care. So this is again for young people who are perhaps with a relative in foster care. They can qualify, even earlier than age 18 for some of these education training vouchers. But again, that same requirements around this also could include young people who exited care to an adoption placement or with a guardian with a relative after the age of 16. And so I hope that's helpful. But again, it is limited to those who are formally involved in foster care.
Thanks, Stephanie. Another question that was in the chat that I just want to elevate as well is questions about providing those direct financial and material assistance to families. I know Anna highlighted that as an opportunity with the Kinship Navigator funds, but this individual is saying the biggest pushback they get to giving the direct assistance is how to qualify them and minimize fraud. Any broad suggestions on that? And I think I'll direct that to Anna or anyone who wants to pipe in.
Well, I shared, it might have been privately with her, that Washington State's Kinship Navigator program has been providing those kinds of direct supports for years using state funds, both for informal and formal families, separate pots of money. And so I suspect we could make a peer-to-peer connection there and get some guidance and best practices from them. But generally, as most of you know who work with these families, fraud is not the issue. The issue is finding them and helping them and having them reach out for help because, there's a lot of guilt with these families about asking for help. So so perhaps we can make that connection.
And if I could just add, I think that the federal government has purposely made it flexible and allowed for those services and even listed those services without making a lot of hoops and requirements to jump through. So, I know states are hesitant. They don't want to get their wrists slapped if they are using these funds for something that doesn't seem to be legitimate. But the reality is, they have listed several very flexible areas that can be funded with Kinship Navigator funds. And I think, if there's any concern, good documentation, but because there isn't a specific federal form to be used, that shouldn't make you shy away from doing it.
Great. Want to acknowledge we continue to get questions about whether or not you'll get the slides. Yes, you will get the slides. There will be a recording, and there will also be a summary document about the provisions that have been highlighted here. I'm seeing a question directed at Stephen about who has to submit. Is it the plan? There's a question specifically directed at Stephen here about who has to submit for something. I'm wondering if it's the state plans.
So if it's the state Title IV-E prevention plans, that's again submitted by the same Title IV-E agency, the State Child Welfare Agency. So they will be the ones who have to submit that plan. And most states have put together a team for working on the state plans for the Title IV-E prevention program. Because the changes for Family First were relatively large, and there will be specific staff through it, but it is the Title IV-E prevention plan is submitted through the state agency. The other part of the question was finding out what they need to submit. We have resources online that we can include with the things that Jaya sends out about what is required in that plan. But as I said, most states are, if they're not at the point of submitting, are partway through their plan or through figuring out what they need to submit. And you would have to contact the state to figure out exactly where they are in that process and what specific things they are needing right now.
Great. And then we'll just close with one last question that I think is a much broader question about kinship in general, although it was phrased as, is there a provision here? But concerns about when parents are making real threats against kinship caregivers, and if there are any actions or any provisions to address that, provide support, help those families access services when they're facing challenges like this. The one place that I thought it's not within the context of this webinar, but may be relevant is accessing TANF. And I didn't know if Anna, you wanted to speak to that briefly, because I think that that's an issue that comes up a lot in this field.
Well, with the temporary assistance for needy families, which is essentially welfare, it's an important ongoing support for many of these families. And there's a type of grant called a child-only grant that's just based on the income of the child, just for the child. And a lot of times caregivers are hesitant to access this support because they have to assign their right to collect child support to the state. And so the state, the caregiver's concerned that the parents could come back and take the child or inflict violence. And so that kind of concern is embedded in that good cause exemption for TANF. It's also embedded in that good cause exemption for foster care maintenance. So there is that kind of concern is envisioned in some public supports.
Great. Thanks, Anna. And Bet, I think you raised that question. We're happy to have additional offline conversation if we didn't fully respond to what you were trying to elevate there.
If I may, there was an excellent question about provisional licensing, and I may have clicked the wrong button. And it would be a good question for Heidi, although I'm not sure she's going to have the answer. But if they take advantage of the 4E reimbursement during the provisional licensing, and then the relative does not meet licensing standards, what happens with that money? What happens,
I think that's a great question. And even more importantly, what happens with the child really kind of depends on the state. Some states have said that if a relative who started that provisional licensing doesn't complete full licensing, that they will remove the child. But other states are really, and most states are flexible to look at ways to keep the child in the kinship caregiver's home. Some states have allowed the provisional licensing to continue until they meet that full licensing. But if it looks like they're never going to, then they may have to look at private custody or guardianship arrangements to keep the child with the kin and take them out of the system, out of the foster care system so they can stay with the kin. But unfortunately, some states will look at, if the relative hasn't met the licensing requirements, moving the child, which we really hope doesn't happen. And we hope that this flexibility will allow states to really work with the kin to finish their licensing process.
Great. Well, I recognize that we're just over time, so I want to extend an enormous thanks to our presenters today and for the excellent questions and for your time on the chat today. Again, reemphasize that there will be follow-up materials and we have your information, so we'll be sure that you get information about follow-up materials, and we will use the questions that have been elevated to guide the resources that we produce going forward. So stay tuned for additional information from us, additional webinar opportunities from us and our partners, and we value the work that you do. Thanks so much. Have a good day.